Okay, meeting is going to be called to order, and this is a special meeting at 9 o'clock. Proceedings of this meeting will be recorded and made available on the internet. Ms. Deputy Clerk, could you conduct the roll, please?
Thank you. Mayor Clarkson, are you present?
I am.
Deputy Mayor Windover?
Present.
Councillor Armstrong?
Present.
Councillor Franzen?
Present.
Councillor Lanshead?
Present.
And from staff, Donna Taggart, CAO Treasurer? Present. Dylan Kosh, Director of Recreation and Facilities?
Present.
Evan Grieger, Director of Public Works?
Present.
Chelsea Carpenter, Supervisor of Waste Operations, Public Works Coordinator?
Present.
And Ann Ruth, Deputy Clerk, is also present. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, can we have a motion to approve this agenda, please? The Deputy Mayor Windover and Councillor Franzen, all in favor? Motion is carried. Delegations, none. Now report, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyone here with pecuniary interest to clear now or at any time in the future? And seeing no hands, thank you. Now reports, Councillor Armstrong, design of new dedicated mechanics facility. A motion to hear this report. Councillor Lanshead and Councillor Franzen, all in favor.
I'm sorry, could I just get clarification?
Would you like me to do this after the report?
Yes.
Okay. Put that motion on hold. Carol, would you like to proceed, please?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I won't read this, but I'll just share some of the highlights. In the interest of trying to focus our meeting today, I put together a very brief backgrounder. The highlights are that it was September of 2020. We had a facilities working group that had been looking at the overall facilities master plan and trying to figure out a path forward for the public works projects. And their direction was to design, tender, and contract for a dedicated mechanics facility at the 49 site with 2 double bays, 1 double wash bay, 2 double equipment bays, and required office space. Then in April 2021, we received a report that indicated the existing public works depot at 49 was in bad repair, and the cost to renovate it would be almost equivalent to replacing it. So in July of 2021, Council directed that we proceed with the new dedicated mechanics facility, but that it also be a shared facility between recreation facility and the public works departments, including fleet maintenance services. Then in November of 2021 and finalized in February of 2022, we set aside a budget for this project of $7.5 million, 6.5 for the depot itself, and $1 million for this replacement of the sand domes. And then I think the next information we received about the project and cost was in July, which is this month. And the project came in at a total of 10.2 million versus our budget of 7.5, which I think gave most of us a bit of a sticker shock. It was the building itself came in under the budget at 6.4 something. However, there were a number of additional things that were surprises, including 1.4 for fireworks and some other items. So that really raised concerns for me and I think other councilors as to why we had a 2.7 million expense over what was budgeted, and caused us to perhaps look deeper at some of the elements of the proposal. And I just want to say kind of in sum, it's not the intent to delay this project. We recognize it's already delayed and it's phase 1 of a 10-year facilities master plan. So there are dependencies amongst those. Secondly, it's not the intent, nor is it council's role to delve into the minute details of the project, but presented with a $2.7 million overage, it's certainly our fiscal responsibility to push back and understand more about this and determine its legitimacy. Legitimacy is the wrong word, justification. Number 3, I think the ideal outcome would be for staff and the consultant to return to council with a project that meets our needs and would cost within the $7.5 million budget. And I recognize that the $10 million was a bit of a surprise to staff as well. So I'm not faulting anybody in terms of the good work that's been done, but we certainly can't let a $2.7 million overrun go forward without some very deep, serious questioning. Thank you.
Okay, well said, and I think we will take questions and comments, and we've got a couple of people on the line here that are going to be very much impacted by this. So I cannot see your hands because I don't see your faces. So please jump in at any time and we will include you in this conversation. You're extremely important to it. The conversation wouldn't be taking place without you. So I'm looking now for comment. Peter.
Yeah, I have a couple comments on the crane. Maybe if Evan could answer these questions after I express my concerns. I would like to know the total cost of the crane. I understand it's 190,000, but what additional works have to be done to accommodate the crane and what are the costs of those additional works? What other municipalities in this area use a crane? I would like to view the operation of a crane system before I could approve the crane being part of the project.
Evan, would you care to step in here, please?
Thank you, through you, Mayor Clarkson. I unfortunately just had some technical issues, so I just caught the end of Peter's question, just in regards to the crane. From my experience with other municipalities, the older buildings, they would not have cranes, but typically in the new builds, they accommodate for cranes as it's big for health and safety, just for the safety of the mechanic. I do have a tour planned of the City of Peterborough Public Works facility next week. So that'll allow me to get an idea of sort of how they operate, especially when it comes to utilizing the crane on a day-to-day basis.
The other part of my question was, Evan, is the total cost of the crane. I understand it's $190,000, but I understand there is additional work to be done to accommodate the crane, like the raising the level of the roof, the structure within the building has to accommodate the crane. So I would like to see what the total cost of the crane would be.
Yes, thank you, through you, Mayor Clarkson, to Councillor Franz, and that is something that can be reviewed by the consultant. It is important that as the crane was identified during the preliminary stages of the design, the accommodation had always been included in the design as it sort of was part of the original sort of direction received from the working group in council.
Okay. You all right?
Okay. I have one additional comment, not on the cranes, but on the sound barrier. I find a fence sound barrier pretty ugly. I would prefer a berm. There's a berm right across from Tim Hortons and Value Mart for the subdivision in location. And it's made of river rock and with trees put on top. I would prefer that kind of system. I think it would look far more attractive than having this ugly fence that's going to deteriorate over the next 10 to 20 years. And I would like the consultant to look into different kinds of sound barriers.
And just to comment on the sound barrier, through you, Mayor Clarkson, to Councillor Franzen, that was one thing that we did look at initially when we received the direction to have a sound barrier. Staff believed that there could have been some cost savings in doing a landscape barrier as well, and we agreed that it would be more aesthetically pleasing. Just however, with the grading that would be required, because if you're having a sound barrier of that height, which is can be up to 4 meters high. There's a certain sloping that you would require, and unfortunately it wouldn't fit on the site. You would lose a significant amount of that southern portion of the site to allow for the proper grading to accommodate the berm.
Thank you.
Evan, how much sound does something like this produce? Because if you look where it is and where they are in Buckhorn, it's right in the middle of everything, and the neighbors there don't complain. Do they? Who complains? Well,
Just a backup. She's backing up for the beat.
for the beat.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Clarkson, to you. So they would, when they completed the noise study, they sort of looked at worst case scenarios. So the one was, as Deputy Mayor Wendover mentioned, was the backup alarms. However, those aren't included because they're a health and safety measure. So they don't include those within the noise study, but it'd be the impact guns. So when they're changing tires on the trucks, et cetera, they're trying to get bolts off the grader that have been seized. It's those loud noise of the bolt, the impact gun on the bolts and stuff like that. They would have the loudest noise, and then as well as when the trucks are dumping during the loading of the domes, there's that bang of the tailgate, and that's another noise that was identified in the noise study. But it's important to consider during this is the noise study was a direction from our building and planning department, and I think their thought was, I don't want to speak for them, however, I believe their thought was if you're developing a new site, typically that's when residents would raise concerns that you would address at that time of developing the new site. So they look at it holistically, how they can ensure that the new development site wouldn't impact the surrounding neighbors.
Well, when you look at the way these facilities run in other areas where they're right tight up against things, I don't remember ever seeing that type of barrier. Like, is this a recommendation or is this something that's necessary? Because it's an expensive piece of work.
So through you, Mayor Clarkson, I can speak to that. So the requirement for the noise study came from our own planning documents. So, whether this is our building or a public or private building, this would have been a requirement study to be done as part of the process. So, we work on the premise that we shouldn't be treated any different than the general public. And we do have to consider the residential properties next door. So this is the recommendation through the noise study that was completed. That's kind of how it came to be.
Okay, questions? Anybody else? Here.
From my view, I think the large amount of cost, I think, is there any savings in reducing the size of the building slightly? That's something that the consultant probably should be answering. I would expect staff to answer that.
I guess without putting anybody totally on the spot, because it's it requires more looking into, but I would like to ask Evan if he thinks that the overall building could be reduced in size and still serve the intended use. And I'm asking this because the previous person in his role, Ivan, was one of the ones that this building was fit to service. And we now have a new kid on the block who has maybe more different ideas. Let's put it that way. Want to jump in?
Thank you, Mayor Clarkson. And just to comment on to answer Terry's question there through you, Mayor Clarkson. It could be something that could be reviewed internally by staff just to ensure that the reducing of the side wouldn't impact any service levels or expected service levels. Obviously, there has been some history in this, as you previously mentioned, there's history in the size of the building and the number of bays. However, I think it's important that as I continue to work here, I have more of a better idea of how the operations, how I envision the operations of the township occur and how to best serve the people of Trent Lakes, just to ensure that we don't spend too much money in a location that quite possibly might not serve the overall greater good of the population in a roundabout way.
Yes,
I
Terry?
think that answers my question, that I think we should have staff review the size of this building, to make sure it does meet our needs and not exceed them.
And I'm a little concerned about the cost of all these design changes and so on. I mean, this just seems to be going on and on and on. Every time we ask something, it costs us more and more money. Doesn't make sense to me. Like, kind of that road up there. North. Gee, $90,000. Put a road on salt rock. I don't know. To me, it's a lot of money spent, nothing.
Yeah, I have a comment, and Evan doesn't have to answer it because he's already answered it to me, but I still don't understand why municipal trucks have to be stored within a garage when you see 50 hydro trucks sitting outside. You drive by where the school buses are, they're all sitting outside. You drive by our local contractors that do road work and construction work, their trucks are all outside, but the municipality has to spend the money to house all their trucks. And I don't know if you extend the life of the trucks, because I believe that you may lessen the life of the truck, being in a heated garage.
Now, everybody's free to answer anybody else's. It doesn't have to go through to Evan or somebody or Donna. Everybody's free to answer into this. Yes.
Through you, could I just make a request that the council members speak into their microphones as much as possible, just to ensure that the voices are well heard. Thank you.
I think that's a really good, I think that's a good comment.
Yeah, you want to hear that?
What's that?
Did they want to hear?
I've already made that comment to Evan privately.
But other people.
I think the bottom line is, without putting blame on anybody or talking overly about the history, I don't think there's anybody sitting at this table that's satisfied with the way it is now and are willing to go ahead with the same types of consultants or whatever that we're using to develop something that's going to cost this much money that we're going to have for this long. So I'm not overly concerned about a delay, because I think if a delay is a delay that the time is well spent, I think we're going to have it a long time. And my feeling is we want to do it right. I don't think it's right now, and I don't think we've had the opportunity to work properly with this consultant. I don't think staff have either. So I'm not sure where we go from here, but I think until we've a lot more answers and we're a lot more satisfied, it wants to be halted. Yes.
Thank you, Madam. I have many, many questions. I'll just start with the actual building itself. Frankly, I would not have even questioned the building size because it is in fact coming in under our budget. So that's great. The problem is that we have all these surprise additional costs, which make us go back to say, well, where could we reduce costs? And the building is obviously one of those. Because in my mind, this needs to come back to council at a $7.5 million price tag, however that needs to be done. Some of the areas I think that need to be looked at, if you look at the cost per square foot, back in 2017, and I realize much has happened since then, nonetheless, it was $170 a square foot. Today, it's $375 a square foot. There was an interim estimate, which council never saw, of $243 a square foot last year. I mean, I would love to see a back of the envelope variance analysis that says how on earth did we get from 170 to 375 per square foot? You know, how much is materials, how much is labor, how much is distribution? Because that's obviously a huge, huge jump, and it's probably justified. It's probably real, but I'd like to understand how we got from there to here. The other question around the building is, can the existing building, we know it's not habitable, although it is being used now, could it be used for any other purposes? For example, cold storage, as Peter has pointed out. You know, can it not be used for anything that would perhaps allow us to reduce the size requirements for the new building? That's all I'll say about the building. I'll come back with some other questions later. So again, I would not even have questioned the building because it's within our budget, but then all these surprise costs come up and I don't know if any of them can be reduced or eliminated. And I think, I may be wrong on this, but I believe the size of the building also impacts the fire water servicing works as well. So there are some dependencies among these things that need to also be considered. So I'm not looking for an answer right now, obviously, but I think a cost per square foot back of the envelope variance analysis would be useful. I think a determination of whether the old building can be used for anything. I think a determination if anything can be stored outside. And then obviously looking to see if the building envelope itself could be reduced.
I think those are good points. I think we may have been, I don't know what the term is, but I think the $7.5 million price tag is irrelevant in terms of a decision. I think the decision should be based on a need. We may not need something at $7.5 million. So if you say, okay, I've got $7.5 million to spend, there's probably somebody more than willing to spend it for you. So I think it would be really, I think it's imperative that we go back to the drawing board with the people who are going to use that facility, with the knowledge of the geographic concerns that we have in this municipality, and determine whether or not what we have there even remotely resembles what we need there. And I don't think it can be tweaked. I think it needs to be reevaluated. I think when we worked on this before, I think the main thing was to get away from the idea that we were going to centralize, we were going to move everything there. And we were pretty much willing to accept the fact that we were going to keep the other ones. But keeping the other ones actually makes it less necessary for this one to be as big as it is, and used in as much, because we're still going to have to maintain services in the other buildings. So I think it's flawed. I don't think the whole process originally was flawed, but I think when the focus went on 49, which has been basically left vacant for years because nobody could figure out what to do with it, and all of a sudden is, okay, we'll put a $7.5 million building there, we'll justify it, but what happens to everybody else? And I think that was I think too much government is done in a single view, as opposed to a circle that takes on the causes and effects of everybody else around the circle. And I don't think you can deal with 49 without dealing with the other three. And once you determine what those other three do and are going to have to do, then you determine what 49 needs to do. And that may be oversimplifying, but to me, those dots haven't been connected. Peter?
I couldn't agree more, Mayor, because we all campaigned in the last election that we were not in favor of a centralized depot. If we built the facility as the diagram shows, everybody's going to say, you still have a centralized depot, it's just a different name. You just called the mechanic facility.
And we may need that, but we don't, do we need what it is? Yes.
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to just pick up on two of the major items under site works, because, you know, something that was a complete surprise to all of us was $1.4 million for a fire water servicing works. And I'm understanding that that is a requirement under the building code. But I'd like to understand, perhaps you could explain it to us again, just so that we're all aware of what the requirement is and have the same level of information. And also talk about any potential alternatives, including, and actually I think this is something you floated, Evan, I don't want to tie you to it, was perhaps making some arrangement with the city of Kawartha Lakes to run a water line up from them, or some other alternatives, rather than having to build our own water servicing works. So again, if you could just explain to all of us why we need that and what alternatives there are, and if there are any ways to reduce costs there. It's the biggest single item other than the building itself.
So through you, Mayor Clarkson, I'll start because that is a building code requirement. So I had some questions myself about this number, and I did put those questions through to Chelsea, who forwarded those to Tyler, and he did kind of respond in his typical fashion, kind of vague, I'll be blunt, but it is a code requirement. I did go into the code yesterday to see if there's any exemptions for that, but it doesn't meet the exemptions. And you know, the very first item is that if a building is less than 200 square meters, it does not require fire protection water. So this building is clearly larger than 200 square meters, so it is a requirement. What the problem is with this item, and it's kind of a consistent theme with regards to the engineer, is he hasn't nailed down. It's kind of a pie in the sky number, because he's saying, well, we can't determine exactly what it's going to be because we don't know the volume of the building. And then he's putting that on the fact about this crane. It seems like he's just kind of threw a number at the wall to say this is the worst case scenario. So to explain the volume part of it, there's a fairly detailed formula in the building code that the engineers are required to follow to determine the amount of water to be provided for a certain amount of time in the event of a fire. And it's based on the size, the volume of the building. It's based on what's in the building as far as flammables and things like that. So they take all of that in consideration. They come up with a volume of water, and then they design the tank to support that water. So what's still unknown to us today is, because they haven't determined the height of the building because of this crane business, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because I don't think that that's a huge thing to figure out. He's just kind of threw, it could be this much water, but it might be less, it might be a little bit more. So I know Chelsea's been really frustrated with the engineer because he's not giving very definitive answers. And I think that's part of your problem today, is because a lot of these extras are not very nailed down. This is what it's going to cost because this is how much water we need, because we don't know the size of the building yet. And that's why you're struggling today. But it is definitely a requirement. Now, if the building is sprinklered and the water is fed from a municipal water source, that is another option. I don't know how far down the road that water source would be, but then you would be into agreements with the next door municipality. I've been involved in something similar in Autonomy South Monaghan with that subdivision that was on Television Road, where the fire suppression water through the fire hydrants was coming from the city of Peterborough. And I can tell you that took a long time to come to agreements with the city of Peterborough, to enter into the agreements to achieve that. So I don't know how City of Kawartha Lakes would operate, but that can be a lengthy process if they don't want to give us the water. Let's put it that way. With regard, I just want a couple more comments just about the size of the building, and I want you to keep in mind a couple things. Construction costs will continue to go up. So even if you reduce the size of the building, construction costs are going to continue to go up. The bottom line out there is there's not enough trades to fill the spots out there to get the work done. People companies are really having a hard time finding people to work for them. So jobs are taking longer and costs are increasing that way. Material costs continue to go up. So just because you make the building smaller, it may not reduce the cost of the building. I'll just put that out there. And I don't want you to, in the essence of trying to save money, and I know that that's your job, is to make sure that you're being fiscally responsible to the taxpayers. You also don't want to build something that doesn't meet the needs of the municipality in the long term. So, cutting down the bays to save some money, and then, 2 years down the road, we figure out we should have put those bays on. So that's something that Evan is probably more can speak to that. And then the existing building, my understanding, the existing building has some structural issues. We've always, I think as long as I've been here, it's always been kind of discussed about you being used as cold storage, but I think that there had to be some work done on the building to make it safe. So there's money that would have to be spent there as well. So that's all I have to say. I don't know whether that's helpful or not, but
Well, I think the more people we hear from, I think all of it is helpful. I'm just not sure that, I don't think anybody around this table is trying to cut down size to save money. I think we're trying to make this facility a facility that we can, that does the job, but it's not overkill, because it's not just a matter of building it. It has to be maintained, it has to be heated, there's taxes to pay on it. It's an ongoing expense. So yes, it may look today as if we're trying to cut everything down here just to save on that 7 point something. But if we're building something we don't need, and I'm not sure that in the conversations we're having, that there isn't space in there that we don't need, that in the long run, that space costs money. And as you say, it's going to cost money to build, but look at what the utilities are doing. And we haven't even, when we ask about putting solar on the roof, oh, well, that's another expense. Well, that's an expense that within 7 years is going to not only pay for itself, but it's going to be being a return. So are we saving money in the right places? Are we spending money in the right places? There's just like when you listen to Barb, when you listen to Evan, when you listen to staff, they don't have any clear vision of what this firm has in mind. They said it's like throwing numbers on the wall. Well, how are we supposed to, who are supposed to be the stewards, making decisions of this magnitude on figures that are being thrown at a wall? We don't have the information we need. If the people we have can't supply it, we need to be looking elsewhere.
Yep, very good point. Very good point, yes.
I think that's what the whole thing is coming down to.
I know myself, I've never been in favor of this big thing all from the start, but I do realize what they should maybe think of is the fact of doing some work to the depots that we have now. Because I do believe that there's been some consideration of maybe doing something at the Galway depot, maybe as far as the fire department and that goes. But I think what they got to look at up there is the fact of if they start taking that building down, I don't think you'll ever get approval to build another one. That's environmentally sensitive area, that whole thing is, and I don't think we get approval to do it. We gotta maintain what we got, not be tearing them all down and trying to rebuild things, as far as I'm concerned. And I've been in this business a long time, but anyway, that's my thought.
Anybody else final thoughts before we get a motion?
I have a couple more questions, if I may.
Yeah.
The first one is around the sand domes, because that's the second highest expense line in the site works area. I know that back in 2016, it was intended that they stay as is, even if a new facility were built. Obviously, that's a long time ago and things change. But I just want to push at that one because, again, it's the second highest expense line in the site works. And is that really necessary? And is $1 million a reasonable estimate for what that will cost?
Evan, I think you have some knowledge of this.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Clarkson. Through you, Mayor, to Councilor Armstrong. So, yes, the sand domes previously may have been identified that they're in working condition, which they are. However, they are operating at a reduced capacity. They're operating at about 60 to 70% of their intended design capacity. This is a result of when they were built back in the 1970s. The opening was designed for the stacker of the day. However, 50 years down the road, the size of the aggregate stackers that they use to load these sand domes has increased. So this sort of limits the ability for the stacker to get into the dome to properly stack it. Furthermore, to those domes, I've had them reviewed by a structural engineer who is an expert within the municipal sand dome business, I guess you could say. Those domes are typical of an MTO yard. The term is called a Fitzpatrick dome. So during the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the MTO was building all these various public works facilities throughout the province, they had one of their engineers, his last name was Fitzpatrick, had this design. However, it's important to note that these designs, even when they were built in the day, were not built to code. So they're substandard structurally, as the roof, the plywood is not fastened to the existing wood frame. So this was identified by the structural engineer. This was all news to me. He advised that this could be remedied by doing work to ensure that the roof is fastened to the structure. However, that cost would be similar of replacing the two domes. And that would still, if you did the work to the roof, it still wouldn't address the issue of operating at 60%.
Can a single larger facility do what those two do?
Yes, and that's the intention of that, is to have one larger dome to replace those two. As well, currently at that site, there is no salt shed. So we cannot store straight salt, which helps during some of those different weather events, such as a freezing rain event. You like to quote unquote sweeten the load. This increases your percentage of salt in your sand salt mixture from 6%, and you try to get it up to about 10 to 15% to help with the melting of the ice forming. So the salt shed would protect the salt from the elements, because if you leave a pile of salt out in the elements, obviously becomes clumpy and not very nice to work with.
Evan, how many plows plow out of there?
So currently through you, Mayor Clarkson, is 5 tandem plows and a pickup plow that operate out of the 49 depot.
And it services what area?
The majority of those plows are, 3 of those are up in the Galway area, and then the other 2 are partially up in the Galway area, but in this Harvey area, this section of Old Harvey.
So if the Galway depot is finished, and that's in part of this plan, will those trucks not move up there? Like why would we drive plows from 49 up to Galway if we've already got plans to refurbish that? And if we did that and we have our salt in these different locations, do we need new salt? Salt don't, like Buckmore's got salt. Cavendish has salt. Galway, I think Galway has salt.
Yeah.
Galway has
Yeah.
salt.
Through you, Mayor Clarkson, there is no dedicated salt storage area at Galway or at Cavendish. Typically what they would do is they would fill the domes, and when the dome gets, one of the material gets down, then you dump a load just inside the dome. But it's not a separate salt storage facility. And just to comment on the logistics of operating directly out of the Galway, that would definitely be something that I would have to review internally. Understanding that when you have more trucks together, it is kind of good, because then the guys can help each other. If the mechanic needs to fix the trucks, then the trucks are at more of a 1 or 2 areas instead of being in 3 or 4 areas. As well as it's important to sort of understand of where a lot of your workforce is coming from, and a lot of the workforce is traveling from a different area than the Galway area.
Peter,
That sounds an awful lot like Central Depot to me.
Through you, Mayor Clarkson, to Councillor Franzen, I would disagree with that comment. However, you're free to your opinion. It's important. You don't want to have 5 or 6 different sites. It's important. It's a balance, right? Because logistically, through you, Mayor Clarkson, to Councillor Franzen, logistically, if you're looking at this just by the books, just by the distances, not accounting for the fact of what Trent Lakes is, ideally, you would want every single truck to come out of one depot. Like in a perfect world, in a perfect municipality, if you had a perfectly centralized area, that would be ideal, and that would be so the mechanic can ensure the trucks are all working in conditions. Obviously, that I don't believe that is feasible in this municipality. However, I do believe you can find sort of a sweet spot between having all 4 depots and having 1 depot where you can maximize your efficiency of your mechanic, where the trucks aren't in multiple different spots, where they're in 2 or 3 sort of locations.
so then in a perfect world, how would you do it? Knowing what our geography is, how would you do it?
Through you, Mayor Clarkson, I do believe, and this is just from my experience that I've had to date, I do believe the way they are operating currently is probably the most efficient way to have the 2 sites. Yeah, that's, and I'd have to do a further review and a more detailed review, but just from what I have experienced in the 10 months, the 2 sites is an efficient way to do it, and probably your best way. And if you do need to operate out of those other sites during the construction season, we do that. However, just the way the municipality is laid out, I think it's good to have the 2 sites at sort of the east and the west side of the municipality.
So you would have Buckhorn look after Cavendish, and you'd have 49 look after Galway. Is that what I'm getting?
Yes, yes.
Carol?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just want to underscore what the mayor has said. Respect what you just said, Ellen, but that is different than the sort of overall master plan that was approved by council going forward. And the reason for keeping the Galway and Cavendish locations was to satisfy the need for closer on-site equipment and facilities. So I think we need to resolve that in moving forward. And I think it had been resolved in our plan. So we need to get our heads around that and revisit that. So I just underscore the mayor's point about considering how the future Galway and Buckhorn and Cavendish facilities will be utilized in the overall system of our public works. So back to the mayor's comment about looking at system-wide operation and efficiencies, given that we have plans to build those other joint facilities, which leads me to, I think, my last question, but perhaps not. And this is more to Donna. I mean, all of a sudden we're looking at something that I don't think we're going to approve. That's 2.7 million more than we budgeted. And yet we have a 5 to 10 year plan to replace public works depots and fire halls in our other areas. And that initially was going to be something like $12 to $15 million in total. And if this costs 2.7 more than we had planned, then what happens to the rest of our plans? And we did have plans to start new construction on other areas next year. So aside from the drag on resources by perhaps looking at 2 major construction projects next year, we also are essentially robbing money from the piggy bank that was planned to be used for future facilities plans. So I agree with the mayor, we need to build something that meets our needs, but I still come from a bottom line perspective that says in the whole planning of our facilities, we've got 7.5 million for this facility. How do you make it to meet your needs and come in at that dollar figure? And that's the challenge I would put out to the consultant and staff. If it were my project, go back and come back to me with a proposal for $7.5 million that meets your needs and it conforms with whatever regulations we need to.
You see, I don't think it's as simple as just taking, say, 49 to deal with Galway and Harvey to deal with Cavendish, because we have fire halls in all of those areas, and those fire halls have got to be refurbished.
So
That,
sorry, through you, Mayor Clarkson. The intention is never to get rid of those sites. I don't want council to think that I would ever get rid of those sites. You always will have loaders at those sites. You'll always have a sand shed up at Cavendish. You always have a sand dome in Galway. You'll always have a garage facility up there because you would want to park your loader, your graders that are up there inside. You give the operators a place to go inside. However, it's just a storage on your operations. And just from my experience, that operations side of thing is more of a staff level decision where the overall planning, yes, we'll always have those depots up in those areas. So I don't want council to think that the intention is to get rid of those sites. We'll always have those sites. We do, obviously, and that's the discussions I've had with Chief Brockbank, is to ensure that because he needs his sites redeveloped, basically his buildings are at the end of their useful life, that we can combine those with a public works garage facility as well, where you can have your fire hall and shared walls where you're sharing your services such as your bathrooms, certain water and things like that. And that was brought to council earlier this year, where we sort of adjusted a couple sites where I believe, and I don't want to speak out of turn, I think Buckhorn was moved ahead of Galway because Buckhorn's a higher priority for the fire department because they really limited on space in Buckhorn. So there was some swapping around with that, but that was more for the fire. And then Public Works is just sort of providing assistance engineering wise, and then combining to save a little bit of money when we do the building itself, because we have needs there as well.
well, and I think, going back to Steve, any new trucks that they're getting in, these buildings have got to be done sooner than later because they can't get them in. Is that not correct, Donna?
Yeah, thank you, through you. So yes, there was a report brought to council on November 15th, 2021, and there was a recommendation in that report from staff to delay the replacement of the Galway depot until 2027, and that was based on a need for a more joint facility there. So as far as the future and how the delay in this project will impact it, it would certainly impact, financially, obviously, based on the report presented by the consultant, we have an extra, he was predicting 18 months to 24 months before the dedicated mechanics facility would be built, which would give us a couple more budget cycles to put some funds through. And we also have been cleared that we would be considering borrowing likely in the long term, because we do have several replacements in the future. So I think it's important to note that yes, the fire department are being impacted currently, and there is a plan to start that joint structure. There was going to be some design in 2023 as part of the budget for that, because currently there are some vehicles for the fire department that they cannot replace. One in particular, I believe it's the Pumper 21, because it won't fit. So it will impact future builds. In recognition that we do now have a new director of public works who may have some different thinking on what is required, and I totally appreciate that. But it is important to note that we do have a plan in place where we most certainly need to look at those other facilities. They are failing. And we do have a contract with the current engineer, who he is at the end of that process for us, the design. So we could certainly have discussions at the staff level and with him, and look at reducing the size based on feedback from Evan, because there are some changes operationally that he would like to see. But I would be remiss if I didn't advise that, it's not that the financing can't happen, because we can look at that. This municipality is strong financially, and we certainly have borrowing power, and the resources can be brought in to assist with future build. But I think you would be looking at, based on our time frame with the election alone, if we have lame duck. We were supposed to go out the month of August for tendering, and that we don't have the tenders at this stage. So we would probably at this point be looking at, obviously this council will be involved in any changes they'd like to see in that build. But we could be looking at the new council awarding any contracts anyway.
I think that's spot on. I think that's absolutely what we need. We cannot at this table be asked to make any decisions when the information we have is so vague. It could be this, it could be that, it could be something else. Now, a question I have, maybe Evan, maybe not. The wells can be really productive in some of these areas. Some of these areas, they could be next thing to dry. Will deep wells service the water without having to put one of these suppression systems in?
Through you, I believe that's likely more of a Barb question.
Who's ever? Barb, are you there? Do you want to talk water?
Sorry, through you, Mayor Clarkson, I apologize. Sorry, I was writing an email there. Can you repeat your question?
Yes, I was saying some of this area, the wells are extremely productive. Other places, they're pretty much dry. If that happened to be a really productive area for water, could you put in 2 or 3 deep wells and use that as your water suppression system?
Well, that would have to be, would have to be engineered. You'd have to determine how much water is available. You'd have to determine if that water can consistently be provided 24/7, basically. That's still an engineer calculation.
But my understanding is that's not expensive, because we had to do that at the rink in Buckhorn, and they went down, and then they put timers on it to see how much water it produced per minute over a long period of time, and then they had to do it over an extended time. And when it produced so much water, it served that capacity. So, and I know it didn't cost a lot of money because we didn't have it. So would that be something that would be worth investigating?
Well, it could be investigated, but I think the concern or the issue that would have to be considered through that process is what would happen if the wells went dry and you didn't have that water source, because you're supposed to have that water protection 365 days of the year. So that would definitely have to be part of the review of that. I'll be honest, I've never seen a building be protected that way. It's either through municipal water, because that water is there 365 days a year, or it's through a tank in the ground, or the other option is that you create a pond to provide the water. When you create a pond, again, that's a calculation. You have to determine the depth of the pond, and you have to take into consideration and account for possibly 2 feet of ice on top of it. So it is a very large pond. It's usually very expensive, and that's why tanks are kind of the optimum option.
And how do you fill the tank if you don't use wells?
Well, you would typically, the tanks are filled the first time around by bringing water to the site, and that's how Tyler has calculated. He's calculated how much water and how much it costs to bring that water to the site. I think he specified $3 the first time per unit, and now he's saying that it's upwards of the $4 per unit. So the water will always be in the tank, and then if there is an event where the fire department comes to take water out of the tank, then that water is replaced after the event. So you fill the tank and the water stays in the tank until it's needed.
So I think we understand that part of it. I just think it would be interesting to find out if other areas that don't have city water actually use their own well sources.
Okay, so let me just backtrack there. So are you saying that you were considering the wells to be the source to fill the tank, or were you considering the wells to just be the only source of water
The water source.
to fill the tank?
Nope,
No tanks. Okay.
nope, to have the pumps attached to them that they're able
Well,
to.
I think the problem with that is that the wells probably wouldn't be able to keep up with the required amount of water per second to put a fire out. I think that would be the ultimate result of that review. And that's why I've probably never ever seen that even as an option in my career. If you're proposing of maybe putting some wells on the site to keep that tank filled, could be a side option.
Well, I know they only have a single well and it passed what they needed per minute, how many gallons. And when the flooding goes on and it goes on forever, it's never drained that well. And that's a big hose that comes out of that thing. So a fire hose is only so big also. So I think if there are communities who don't have water, it would be interesting to see if any of them use their own groundwater.
So through you, Mayor Clarkson, the code requires you to be able to put water on a fire for a certain amount of time. So you have to ensure that you have that water for a certain amount of time, and that could be an hour, that could be 2 hours, consistently pumping water. So there would have to be a lot of very quick return on that well to keep up with that capacity.
Okay, just a suggestion. Let's get some going forward here today. I think we want staff to go back and look at the concerns that we've drawn this morning with both the engineering. Find out what kind of situations we are locked into with present day consultants, and have this meeting again just as soon as we can get some of this information together. And then if council members have individual concerns that come up after the fact, please contact Donna to send them through to wherever they need to go. Because we've had a lot of information, a lot of input today, and I know when we leave here, there's going to be questions we had asked. Carol, you've done extensive work on this. Have you questions that haven't been answered today?
No, thank you for the opportunity. No, I think
You're okay?
I think I'm good.
Terry, you're okay?
I think I'm okay. The cost increase per square meter of building is enormous, so we need to kind of look at that.
Because the peaks of this 6 months ago have actually eased off a bit too. Are you okay,
Yeah.
Peter?
Okay.
I just want to emphasize that I still have major concerns about the crane system. And I don't want to be the only municipality in Peterborough County that has a crane system. But in the meantime, I would certainly want to get the costs overall costs for the crane system.
Well, I think that's really important because the building has to be higher. There's a whole lot of stuff that's involved in the crane.
And apparently you need a better structure to hold the crane up. You have to move piers and all different things like that. So, I mean, we might be looking a lot of money. It's way more than $190,000. It's probably over $500,000.
When you include the whole thing.
The whole thing.
Okay. So specifically, your ask is the cost of the crane and all of the additions to the building that requires the crane.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay.
Through you, Mayor Clarkson, to Councillor Franzen, I can give you a breakdown of the cost of the crane itself, and that's where the 190,000 comes from. When it comes to the extra cost of the building to accommodate the crane, that is where staff are still, that's an unknown for staff right now, and we're looking to get that clarification from Greenview, hopefully sooner than later, to understand that. But the direction that we have from Greenview at this point is the fact that they can't proceed with the final design of the building in that regard until they have the design of the crane. And that is supposed to be coming from a supplier sometime this week. But I can give you a breakdown of the cost of the crane and the installation of it itself, if you would like.
But Chelsea, I need the whole package.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know if you wanted that information today, just on the cost of the crane itself, but we can definitely get you the cost.
If you have that information handy, you could email me a copy today, but I certainly want to have the whole cost of the crane.
For sure. Yep, just like the impact that it has on the overall design of the building.
Yep, what impact it has on the overall budget of the building.
Yep. Yeah, we can definitely get that as soon as we have that from Greenview, and I can send you the cost of the crane itself.
Okay.
So you have that number. I can send that to council.
Okay. Can you send me a diagram of the crane or some pictures so I can wrap this in my brain of what it actually looks like?
I can see what I have available and what I can get to send to you for sure.
Because the comments that Evan made, it made it sound to me like the only facility within this area is that in the city of Peterborough, in their mechanics facility. So I don't even know if they have anything like that in the city of Kawartha Lakes, or maybe SAP could do some investigation of a place where I could view this crane actually working.
And if there aren't more municipalities around using them,
I should send out the information to all of us.
sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we need to get the questions answered that have been asked today, and sooner than later as far as Greenview is concerned. And we don't want any more, well, it could be this and it could be that, it could be something else. And because I don't think there's a person around this table willing to go ahead with this project until we know an awful lot more about it.
Yeah.
Is that,
Right
is
on.
everybody in agreement with that?
I just want to have one further comment.
No, you've had them all.
I should have had them all, but we can certainly approve this as a council, but the budget is going to be decided by the incoming council. So I don't know about the process.
I think the process coming back the next week, the next meeting, is going to answer a lot of the questions we've got. Then we're going to go back again and see how many of those answers make sense to us. And if we were lucky enough that they made sense to us, then we can go ahead with it. If they don't, it's going to need to go to the next council.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Does that sound right?
Yep, yep.
Because if the information we get back is not accurate enough, we're probably going to have to go back to the drawing board. Because I think we're building bad things out of bad things. But
Okay.
anyway, nobody is at fault here. We're only at
No.
fault
Yep.
if we go ahead without being clear in our own minds that the decisions are necessary. And we're not there yet. Yes, Carol?
Should we try for a motion?
Yes.
Let me take a stab.
Please.
You said it really well, but let me see if I can remember. So the motion is that council is directing staff to address the concerns that were raised in the meeting today and bring those back as soon as possible with concrete information, including opportunities that they can identify for reducing the cost of the proposal.
And also, I think how it fits into the future vision of the entire municipality.
amendment accepted and
Yeah,
added.
Yeah.
including the satellites.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need a second. Seconded by Deputy Mayor Windover. All in favor?
Yeah.
Thank you, folks, very much.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
We just need to do the adoption of the confirming bylaw now.
Okay, can we do that? Can we have a motion to adopt the confirming bylaw?
Sure.
Deputy Mayor Windover and Terry. Why
Turn
do
your
I
name
find,
tag off.
Terry, why do I find that so hard? Can you tell me that? Because it's been hard for 4 years.
I know. That paperback.
No, I just have to think. Yes,
If you could just call for the vote.
yes, may we have a vote, please? All in favor?
Yeah.
Now, can we have a motion to adjourn? Everybody,
Mhm.
Councillor Armstrong, Councillor Terry,
Councilor Terry.
all in favor? Motion is carried. You get better, Donna.